This is part of our Public Thinking lecture series, which is this joint initiative between Parousia and The Point magazine. And the goal of this series is to create opportunities to reflect on both the philosophy and the practice of public thinking, and in particular to bring together theorists of public discourse with practitioners, that is, journalists and critics, editors and educators, activists and artists, who can report on their firsthand experience dealing with the challenges and opportunities of public engagement in a rapidly evolving cultural landscape. Occasionally, we're lucky enough to have someone who is both a theorist and a practitioner of public thinking and writing, and that is the case with our speaker today, Merve Emre. To begin with, Merve is a highly accomplished academic, currently serving as the Shapiro Silverberg Professor of Creative Writing and Criticism at Wesleyan University and the director of the Shapiro Center for Creative Writing and Criticism. There, she's helping build a program aimed at undergraduates who are interested in public criticism, which I've often consulted as a model as we try to build our own program for public thinking here in Chicago. By the way, Merve has made very clear to me how much she loathes the term public criticism or in public thinking. I suspect it may even come up in the lecture we're about to hear. Merve is also the author of several books with both academic and trade presses, beginning with Paraliterary, The Making of Bad Readers in Post-War America, which she published with the University of Chicago Press in 2017, continuing with the co-authored work The Ferrante Letters in 2019, and a year before that, The Personality Brokers, a book about the Myers-Briggs personality tests, which had the unlikely side effect of turning Merve into a talking head on an HBO documentary that was inspired by the book. Alongside this work, Merve has been the editor of The Once and Future Feminist, a 2018 collection on feminism, past, present, and future, and has edited and written the introductions to so many new editions of classic and translated works of literature that we would use up all the rest of our time if I were to list them. She is currently working on a book about the post-disciplinary future for literary studies, which promises to continue to develop a thematic that has been prominent in her work since Paraliterary regarding the way that what she calls their institutions of literacy, institutions that include but are not by any means limited to the university English department, shape the reading habits of both professional and non- or paraprofessional readers. At the same time that she has been doing her scholarly work and writing her thousands of book introductions, Merve has also somehow found time to become an award-winning critic. She is a frequent contributor to magazines like the New York Review of Books, where she also runs a podcast on criticism, Harper's, the London Review of Books, and the New York Times Magazine, and of course now the New Yorker, where she is a contributing writer. She is also a founding member of Reading Room, the short-lived but explosive COVID-era experiment in collective column writing at The Point. As a critic in the tradition of Susan Sontag, a collection of whose essays Merve has of course written an introduction for, Merve has always worked, at least to my mind, along two tracks. On the one hand, she has introduced her audiences to underrated or forgotten writers, either from the past or from abroad, sometimes both, characteristically with an infectious passion and intelligence that wins these works an enthusiastic new audience among readers who may never previously have heard of their names. I know that I've personally ordered several books by authors whose names I can't even pronounce in the middle of reading articles by Merve. At the same time, she's also written several landmark essays on the state of criticism or literary writing, beginning with her Two Paths for the Personal Essay, published in the Boston Review in 2017, and continuing more recently with works such as The Illusion of the First Person, a critical history of the first-person narrator, published in the New York Review of Books in 2022. The combination of genuine and inspiring enthusiasm for the work she is herself inspired by, combined with the critical attention she pays to the deep questions of what it means to be a critic in our current cultural climate, are what make her, to my mind, such a perfect fit for this lecture series, as well as one of my favorite living critics and writers about literature. And with that, I invite you up, Merve, for your talk. Titled The Function of Criticism.
Thank you. I feel very moved by that introduction, John, and very tired suddenly after hearing what I've been doing. I've given, I think, 3 or 4 talks at this university, but all have been over Zoom, so this is the first time I've actually been here. It's a little bit like talking to someone online for years and then meeting them in person, so it's really nice to see all of you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me. I was supposed to be here last year for a conference that John organized on criticism, and I got stuck in the airport in New York and couldn't come, so I was mostly broadcast as a giant head on this screen, I believe. Yes, some of you were here, and the benefit of that was that I got to say things like, we're all post-Habermasian now, and then run away without explaining what I meant, so here you can actually hold me accountable for the things that I say. I want to just make 4 introductory points to frame the remarks that I'm going to make about the function of criticism and give you a sense for what inspired this talk, both in some of the administrative program building work that I've been doing that John alluded to at Wesleyan, and in the work that I do as a critic at The New Yorker, where in addition to bringing attention to forgotten women writers usually or translated works, I'm often asked to translate academic monographs for non-academic readers. The 2 examples of that being a piece, the first piece actually I ever wrote for The New Yorker was on Sian's wonderful book on the theory of the gimmick. And probably the most recent example of this was on John Guillory's book, Professing Criticism. So as someone who's often asked to try to toggle between different idioms or sociolex, the language of the academy and the language of the New Yorker reader, which a friend of mine likes to describe as the dentist in Syracuse, I spend a lot of time thinking about how, if at all, we can make that toggling programmatic. Okay, so as John told you, and as I spoke about when I zoomed in as a talking head last year, I run a center for criticism, and one of the things that I've been asked to do is design a curriculum for criticism that is somehow distinct from the curriculum of the discipline of English literature. One thing that became very clear to me immediately in designing that curriculum was the deep schism between how one teaches criticism if one is teaching reading and how one teaches criticism if one is teaching writing. Which is to say, we have a number of courses on the craft of criticism, either specific kinds or genres of criticism, or specific areas like literary criticism, art criticism, music criticism, sports criticism for the upcoming World Cup. But that's a little bit different from teaching people how to read with an eye to producing criticism. In a class on writing, you can teach the craft of writing, you can teach students how to write to certain kinds of generic specifications, to certain kinds of institutional expectations. In a class on reading, it's a little bit harder to know what exactly it is that you are teaching. As Agnes and I will model tomorrow night, I teach a class on practical criticism that's just kind of taken from I.A. Richards' class of the same name from the 1920s, and I teach it along with Kant's third critique. So that's the entirety of the class, and there it feels like what we're teaching is something more like the craft of thought rather than the craft of writing. So that's one project that's kind of orbiting the remarks that I will make today. The second project that is in the background of these remarks is that I have had for the past 3 years a speaker series at Wesleyan called The Critic and Her Publics. It also functions as a podcast, which some of you have very generously told me that you listen to, so thank you for being good listeners. And that speaker series was also basically modeled after the Richardsonian model of criticism, which is a critic would come to Wesleyan, they would sit on a stage rather like this with me. I would talk to them a little bit about their kind of theory of criticism, and then what I wanted was for people to actually model how to do it. And so I would spring a surprise object on them, and those objects would range from manifestos to poems to cultural objects like Barbie dolls to cookies for the New Yorker's food critic, and they would have to show in real time spontaneously what it meant to perform criticism. And if any of you have listened to that podcast, to the first season in particular, you know that our final guest was the critic and novelist Christine Smallwood, who was a very intransigent guest. She did not want to do the exercise, right? I think I gave her the prologue to Middlemarch, and she was just like, no, I won't do this. And one of the things that she asked me was, she said, why do you do it this way? Why is the spontaneity of conversation so important to you when for most of us criticism is actually about writing? What is it for you that makes speech and conversation the kind of privileged site of criticism as opposed to just sitting at a desk putting one word after another and doing that over and over again? And I realized that part of my frustration with that, or that account of criticism, probably had something to do with the status of writing at the moment. I think we are living through a time right now where it is possible for just about anybody with an internet connection to produce criticism in written form about any cultural object and to mount it on Substack or Goodreads or what have you. So there has been an interesting kind of democratization of the possibilities of writing criticism that has changed its status as a historical category or a historical genre. And at the same time, we're also living through a time of the de-skilling of writing. And so that tension between the democratization of writing and the de-skilling of writing, a tension that will be familiar to anybody who has, who just studies the history of different arts of mechanical reproduction, was what made me feel like the dialectic between reading and writing that so much of criticism has turned on had started to go slack. And I wanted to find some different way or some different medium for the production of criticism that turned away from writing or that investigated an alternate term to plug into that dialectic. So that's the second thing that's going on in my remarks. And then the third and final thing I will say is that for those of you who are professors of English literature, you will know that many of our conversations about the status of the discipline are conversations about metacriticism, and one often feels that people talk about criticism more than they actually do criticism. And they often talk about the history of criticism by pulling on very, very particular figures who they return to over and over again. And I think it was about 4 years ago I was having breakfast with Alan Thomas at the Study at New Haven, and he said, why doesn't anybody consider Virginia Woolf in their histories of criticism? Why is the model of the critic speaking to the common reader not a more important part of that history? And that actually sent me back in my history of criticism class to various women who were working outside of the academy in genres that didn't quite fit into either professionalized writing, or it didn't quite fit into models of professionalized writing, who felt like they had to forge some kind of a new way forward for criticism. So those are just the kind of three things that will be in the background of this talk, which now I will start, having made all of those prefatory remarks. Okay. To ask what is the function of criticism at the present time is also to ask two related questions. What was the function of criticism in the past, and what could be the function of criticism in the future? These are anxious questions. One would not ask them if all was well in the state of cultural production and consumption, nor would one ask them if the established sources of authority, whatever they may be, had already provided clear and compelling explanations for what criticism does, how it does what it does, and who it does it for. Anxious questions often produce anxious answers. Some people have identified the function of criticism by appealing to the ideas or the careers of individuals. For instance, Terry Eagleton's Critical Revolutionaries picks T.S. Eliot, I.A. Richards, William Empson, F.R. Leavis, and Raymond Williams as the most original and influential of modern times to argue that a vital tradition of literary criticism is in danger of being neglected. Other people create typologies of critics based on their methods, their professional affiliations, or their social networks. Eagleton's first critic, T.S. Eliot, in his 1961 address to criticize the critic, describes the four types of critics that one encounters in print: the newspaper critic or the super reviewer, although those increasingly do not exist, as we know from the news coming out of the Washington Post books desk today. The newspaper critic or the super reviewer, the critic with gusto, the academic or theoretical critic, and the poet critic. It is into this company that I must shyly intrude, Eliot writes, but he does not seem in the least bit shy. His argument represents only a superficial elaboration on the typology in his 1920 book, The Sacred Wood. In it, he divides critics into just two types, perfect and imperfect. There are as many varieties of imperfection as there are people writing, and the perfect critic, the possessor of a rare, unpopular, and desirable sensibility, is one with the creative artist like himself. I am disinclined to anchor our thinking to the authority of individuals or the desirability of types. I'm wary of claims to exceptionality and warier still of the imperious exercises by which bank clerks and bureaucrats create categories in order to sort people into them. By focusing so intently on the individual, whether 5 or 50, these approaches misrecognize what is really at stake in the question, the fate of a genre that has, for almost its entire modern history, struggled with a crisis of authority, or as John Guillory has put it recently, a crisis of legitimation. To misunderstand the nature of this crisis is also to misunderstand what the genre needs to regain some sort of footing. It does not need men of genius or idealized figures. It needs an anchoring set of concepts or rationales that are both expansive and specific enough to guide the great variety of writing, reading, and speaking that passes under the sign of criticism today. It is also my belief that criticism's rationales ought to be derived from its long history as a genre. By genre, I mean that criticism marks out a category of discourse, a set of utterances that conform to distinct conventions. In this case, and I think I said this last year, criticism is a series of persuasive utterances that mingles judgment and interpretation. Genres are mostly historically continuous formations. They do not change overnight, although they can and ought to evolve. Often they cannot be changed according to the whims of individuals, although they can and ought to make room for the free play of individual talents. And genres are always influenced by the context by which they are produced and disseminated. For instance, institutions like Parisia, which is generously hosting this talk, or The Point, where John first encountered or solicited my work 14 years ago. Is that right? I think we've known each other for about 14 years. Yeah. These contexts are in turn shaped by broader political and cultural considerations. For instance, the private American universities' financial support for the arts and the humanities, which allows institutions to thrive or fall, or the state or federal government's legislation of speech and education, probably the most powerful determinant of the kinds of risky utterances that would characterize a speaker or a critic as a, how do I pronounce it? Thank you. The most illuminating way to analyze the function of criticism is first to situate its authority or lack thereof within the politics of the state, second, to relate it to the institutions of cultural production and distribution, third, to orient it to the intellectual practices by which the genre is produced, and fourth, and only fourth, to credit it as the product of the critic's idiosyncratic mind. To narrate the authority of criticism in all its richness and variety requires starting from the inside of this arrangement, from the mind, and working our way outward to the contexts in which criticism circulates. And I would like to proceed tonight by offering you 4 historical concepts keyed to the 4 levels of analysis that I've identified. And those concepts are wit, discrimination, judgment, and advocacy. What I just described now as the idiosyncratic product of the critic's mind can be summarized in the single word wit, a word that suggests humor, curiosity, delight, imagination, and the play of the intellect, a word that transports us back to the middle of the 17th century and so to the beginnings of English literary criticism. Most people would probably want to peg that to something like, or someone like John Dryden, but I would actually like to talk about The World's Olio, a 1655 collection of writings on poetry, history, and romance by the Duchess of Newcastle, Margaret Cavendish, in which she names wit as the swiftest motion of the brain, the wild and fantastical essence of all thoughts when they come into contact with objects in the world. Wit makes use of all things, it encircles all things, Cavendish writes. In encircling all that appears in the world's olio, painting, literature, music, science, politics, and society, wit turns excited and associative. It hears voices, it draws connections. It gaily hops, then skips its way to ever grander and more polymathic ideas. Wit refreshes the variety of discourse by placing words to its own becoming, delight, and advantage. And this delight and this advantage only deepens the pleasure that wit takes in the drama of its own emergence, in its ability to fabricate its own material. In wit begins criticism, but there is nothing sneering or pushy or pretentious or doctrinaire about it. Cavendish is careful to tell us that wit is measured not by mere jests or the demonstration of one's cleverness at the expense of others. It is measured by the ability to move passions and to make passions. To make a passion is not to invent a feeling whole cloth, to conjure something out of nothing. It is the ability to take one's perception or impression of an object and to subject it to the earnest, protean, and fleet-footed movement of consciousness, to expose what one has seen, heard, tasted, and touched to the sun of the brain so that it may receive its illumination and its fast-spreading heat. Wit sweetens melancholy, dresses joy, it quenches fear, raiseth hopes, eases pain, Cavendish lists. It mourns with sorrow, mends faults, it moves compassion, it begs pardon. And we should note that she describes both wit's enhancements and more ardently wit's compensations, that it can raise hope just as it can sweeten melancholy, quench fear, ease pain, and mend faults. In turning an object over and around, wit can change one's perception of what the true nature of a thing is. What Cavendish describes as wit and what I want to place as the kind of innermost concept at the heart of critical practice emerges as a form of charismatic authority, an authority that orbits but is not limited to a single person. It is a tendency and a tool for joining feeling to thinking, mind to word, sensation to persuasion, and the individual to the world around her. Wit is like a pencil that draws several figures, Cavendish explains in one of her allegories in The World's Olio. It takes what is inside and invisible, what is artless and personal, and makes it intelligible to others through the objects that it engages and enchants. In communicating the intensity of thought, wit urges others to try to feel as one does, to appreciate that sweetness and melancholy, or to be moved to compassion in a situation where one's first response might be pity or disgust. And in making this offering to others, it becomes ever more emboldened by its own passions. Wit's charismatic authority comes bearing an antipathy to the constraints of formal education. Throughout The World's Olio, wit's exuberance is opposed to what Cavendish describes as the persuasions of rhetoric, a curriculum of academic study that was largely available only to men, and that emerged during the 16th and 17th centuries as an object of scorn for early modern women writers. Cavendish warned that wit was not to be hidebound with nice and strict words and set phrases, as if the wit were created in the inkhorn and not in the brain. Rules were devastating to its powers of play and persuasion, and in her 1666 utopian romance, The Blazing World, she turns this warning into a fantastical allegory, imagining a realm where animal-human hybrids speak and hold artistic and intellectual offices. The rhetoricians and the logicians are cast as magpie, parrot, and jackdaw men, and encouraged by the charming and powerful empress of wit who governs them to consider more the subject you speak of than of your artificial periods, connections, and parts of speech, and leave the rest to your natural eloquence. As Cavendish's husband put it in the poetic epigraph that precedes The Blazing World, his wife's imagination exalted pure wit, a creating fancy that brooked no formulaic chatter by learned animals or learned men. Cavendish's anxieties about scholastic authority lets us turn from wit as the perfect freedom of thought to possibilities for how this thought could be guided and strengthened as one might tone a muscle through exercise. I want to leave 1655 and, making my apologies, leap over several familiar touchstones, the writings of Dryden, Joseph Addison, Samuel Coleridge, Matthew Arnold, John Ruskin, and Walter Pater, and land on not exactly a less familiar one, but maybe a more surprising one for these purposes, the novelist George Eliot's 1868 Notes on Form in Art. Eliot's notes are less a comprehensive program for criticism than a series of jottings on how one should evaluate literature systematically in relation to the second level of analysis I mentioned, genre. Yet it's here that we find the most useful explanation of our second concept of criticism, discrimination. If wit primarily heightens and deepens one's subjective impressions, then discrimination imparts to these impressions a shared language, a sense of definition, of precision, and clarity. It molds them into a discernible shape, or to use Eliot's preferred term, it gives them a distinct form. Form, Eliot writes, is the limits of that difference by which we discriminate one object from another. Anyone can sense or intuit form, she explains, but the function of the critic is to express it, to transfigure form from a matter of feeling into a matter of knowledge. And this knowledge must be grounded in the complex and totalizing process that Eliot describes as the discrimination of wholes and then the discrimination of parts, whether in a painting, a work of literature, or a piece of music. How does the discrimination of wholes and parts produce knowledge for Eliot? Consider a literary artifact like her own novel, Middlemarch. Probably, she says, we're inclined to describe it as a 19th century novel, a discrimination that lets us differentiate it from a 19th century history, like Thomas Carlyle's The French Revolution, or a 19th century biography. We may further describe it as a realist novel, a discrimination that lets us differentiate it from other genres, for instance, a romance like Jane Eyre, or a utopia like Mary Bradley Lane's Misora. And finally, discrimination can open onto judgment. We may even further claim, as one or two critics have, that Middlemarch is the greatest achievement of English realism, which would require discriminating between its realism and, for instance, the realism of Dickens's Bleak House or Great Expectations. Articulating likenesses and unlikenesses alike, we may situate the novel as a whole alongside other wholes of its kind and as part of a larger whole, like the system of genres or all the writings of the 19th century that have been preserved for us in the present. A lot of holes. We love ourselves a lot of holes, yeah. But how would we determine that this is a realist novel in the first place, let alone the greatest achievement of English realism? For that matter, how would we begin to define realism? We would have to examine both the novel's parts and the parts of novels like it, and we would have to come up with a justification for how these parts make up a distinctive totality. And as the novel's parts, we could pick out individual words, sentences, paragraphs, or chapters, or we could pick out plots, characters, settings, dialogues, narrators, or styles of narration. Ideally, we would proceed by separating and identifying all its features, then drawing them back together, a process that we would repeat over and over again to construct an account of the novel's overall artistic strategy. We would not go about our work like Eliot's clergyman, Mr. Casaubon, a dried bookworm towards 50, in whose scholarly circles cleverness implies mere aptitude for knowing and doing apart from character. Instead, we would work with the alacrity of a child who sets out to solve an especially forbidding jigsaw puzzle, sorting the edges from the middles, trying a piece here and there, turning it, fitting it, turning it again, until every piece is in its proper place and a smooth and startlingly clear picture has arranged itself before her eyes. Or, as Eliot puts it, knowledge continues to grow through alternating processes of distinction and combination. It arrives at the conception of wholes composed of parts more and more multiplied and highly differenced, yet more and more absolutely bound together by various conditions of common likeness or mutual dependence. Crucial to her idea of discrimination is repetition, which takes the discriminating capacity of the individual and tethers it to form as a socially and historically constrained phenomenon. A form does not arise by fiat. One cannot simply claim to have created a new kind of novel called, for instance, Furry Sleuth or Canadiana and have it be so. I did a Google search for fake kinds of novels and these come up. The authority of form is established through what Eliot describes as the recurrence of its elements in adjustment with certain given conditions of sound, language, action, or environment. Repetition stabilizes discrimination's claims about what is like and unlike, and in turn, the capacity to discriminate trains writers to write themselves into specific traditions and trains critics to apprehend both the tradition and the variations from it. Form can be sought after, amplified, and elaborated, Eliot explains, but it can also grow predictable and be subject to the abuse of its refinement, starved into an ingenious pattern work. The question that arises, but that is never answered at the end of her notes, is how a critic ought to discriminate between an interesting and purposive elaboration and a tedious repetition, between an innovation and a cliché. This is not just a problem of the authority of discrimination, but a problem of the authority of judgment, which is our third term. Among the best readers of both Cavendish and Eliot was Virginia Woolf. Her 1925 collection of essays, The Common Reader, includes spirited essays on both writers, as well as a concluding essay on what she perceived as the chaotic state of 20th century literary criticism called How It Strikes a Contemporary. In the first place, Woolf begins, a contemporary can scarcely fail to be struck by the fact that two critics at the same table at the same moment will pronounce completely different opinions about the same book. One will call it a masterpiece, the other a mere mass of waste paper. Is one wrong and the other right? Or does the hyperbole of both statements suggest that something is amiss in how judgment is practiced within the institutions of literature? What was that?
Was it a rhetorical question?
Yes. Well, I'll go on to answer it. You seem to really want to talk.
No, I'm just interested. I'm used to call and respond, so I'm tuning in a dialogical fashion.
Got it. Cool. Okay. Certainly part of the problem is that it's impossible to know which critic to trust. Indeed, one suspects that both lack the necessary sway, or as Woolf describes it, the rule and discipline that allowed the critics of the 18th and 19th centuries to consolidate their power. Somehow, by the 20th century, the cultural center had failed to hold. The forms of literature and the integrity of criticism had fragmented. The scattered dinner tables of the modern world, the chase and eddy of the various currents which compose the society of our time, could only be dominated by a giant of fabulous dimensions, she writes. But searching, she finds no giant to draw it together. There is, for her, no Dryden, no Johnson, no Coleridge, no Arnold, no Flaubert. Hardy, Eliot, Forster, Lawrence, and Conrad will not do. Reviewers we have, but no critic. A million competent and incorruptible policemen, but no judge, she pronounces. And judgment, she believes, strikes these authoritarian notes because its practitioners know, if only subconsciously, how little authority they truly bear. And this is one way, I think, to understand the enduring genre of the pan as a particularly hysterical model of the assertion of this kind of authority. It's worth lingering on Woolf's pointed and, to me, instructive metaphor to understand how authority has lapsed into the mere illusion of it. Policemen correct behavior by enforcing the laws that are set by others. Judges use their interpretive autonomy to shape the laws themselves. Those of you who are familiar with Woolf's lectures in a room of one's own concerning the education of women may recall that the specter of the policeman haunts it too. He appears in the form of the Oxbridge professor who stares disapprovingly at her for walking on the grass of the college lawn instead of following the path that borders it. One of those men of taste and learning and ability who are forever lecturing the young and celebrating the dead, she remarks in How It Strikes a Contemporary. And just as Cavendish expresses her mistrust of rhetoric, Woolf, who is not formally educated, expresses her mistrust of the university, which bends to its will the minds and manners of all who inhabit it, men of taste and distasteful men alike. At Oxford, the grass is not to be trod on, but to be admired. I used to let my kids pee on the lawns. I thought that was a nice little act of resistance. While the books are not to be admired, but to be disemboweled, vivisected, taxidermied, so much so that the frequent result of the scholar's able and industrious pens, she writes, is a desiccation of the living tissues of literature into a network of little bones. The academy is where the general discipline of the critic has turned into the specialized disciplines of philosophy, philology, history, and English, and so entombed has grown weak and weedy, choked by the noxious professional cares that afflict, for instance, the poor, pathetic, and tyrannical Mr. Ramsay into the lighthouse, or the crooked, crabby dons and deans of a room of one's own. Unlike the scholar or the policeman, the judge for Woolf is self-authorizing. However, she's no more a renegade than the novelist. As the novelist is beholden to form and its discriminations, so the judge is or should be beholden to precedent. For Woolf, the critic's judgment of contemporary works must take place against a backdrop of expansive historical and geographical knowledge. One should never compare a contemporary novel to the novels published in that same year so as to decide, as Woolf puts it, whether to spend half a guinea at Hatchard's or to walk to the London Library or to give it a prize. Instead, one should judge it with reference to the history of the novel in England, in France, in America, in Russia, which any given novel is almost certainly laboring to extend, not to revolutionize. Readers and critics should take a wider, a less personal view of modern literature, Woolf urges, and look indeed upon the writers as if they were engaged upon some vast building, which being built by common effort, the separate workmen may well remain anonymous. So history is the scaffolding of literature and criticism. It protects the novelist from the pressure of making things new by writing a novel that aims to be out of time. He may settle, Woolf says, for being competent and entertaining, which are by no means minor accomplishments. And it saves the critic the embarrassment of acting hysterical in public. She will know better than to labor, to praise, or to savage a work that is sure to be forgotten almost as soon as it has been published. And it steadies the critic to make truly forceful, truly meaningful pronouncements when the time is right. Pronouncements that she can justify as a possessor of a willfully anachronistic discipline, a consecrator, not a desecrator of literary culture. And Woolf thus invites her future critics to scan the horizon, see the past in relation to the future, and so prepare the way for masterpieces to come. Yet preparing the way for masterpieces to come demands more than wit's passion, discrimination's knowledge, and judgment's historicity. What we must consider now is our fourth and final term, advocacy, and its relationship to the fourth level of analysis, the state and its support or its lack thereof for the arts. Among the most careful readers of Woolf was Toni Morrison, who, like Woolf, was skeptical of the institutionalization of the critic in the figure of the schoolteacher. As Morrison writes in her essay on Romare Bearden, separating art forms, compartmentalizing them is convenient for study, instruction, and institutions. However, it's not sensitive to the work of art itself, which often speaks across different areas of study, or to its publics, which are often constituted by different audiences with different desires. The uniqueness of art for Morrison lies in how it can be many things to many different people. It can be an object of pleasure or instruction, just as it can be a commodity to be bought and sold. No one person's needs or desires can account for it in its entirety. And whatever the medium of the artwork might be, it benefits more from an approach that acknowledges its porousness or its liquidity, as Morrison calls it. This liquidity is not only aesthetically and intellectually preferable, but also materially necessary for art and criticism to thrive. To accept the separation of art into different spheres for the purpose of studying it is to drive a series of wedges between all who might be invested in its preservation. To follow the lead of the market and its producers and consumers is to leave a great deal of art that might be perceived as experimental or avant-garde, vulnerable to carelessness, whimsy, and disdain, Morrison writes. For her, it makes no sense to accept as natural or normal any institutional structures that cut readers off from one another at a time when the tools for making art matter to ever larger, ever more diverse populations, and at a time of material drought, she laments, when the state no longer supports either the creation or the study of various art forms. The term that she uses to describe the critic's active, collective, and integrated expansion of art across institutions and specializations is advocacy. She's quick to differentiate the authority of arts advocacy from what she describes as mere advocacy, what she dismisses, as mere advocacy, which she describes as the expectation that as a Black woman, every statement that she makes will necessarily agitate against racism and sexism, even or especially when those statements are made in settings that perpetuate inequality, like her own Ivy League university or the museum. Arts advocacy is for her not about the individual and her symbolic gestures. The story of the beleaguered, solitary individual struggling against Philistines willy-nilly, who somehow breaks through the walls of ignorance and prejudice to acclaim, is for Morrison just that, a story, and not a new or interesting one at that. True advocacy is about developing wide-reaching and comprehensive political strategies in state arts organizations, educational institutions, foundations, communities, and neighborhood groups, she argues. It's about organizing the work of making and circulating art and criticism in fundamentally different ways. Throughout her essays, in her discussion of advocacy, the figure of the critic is often paired with another figure, the figure of the citizen. We should not understand the citizen as the passive recipient of rights based on the accident of birth. This understanding of citizenship has terrible nationalistic associations. Instead, we should understand the citizen as an active participant in the shared project of creating and disseminating access to common goods like art, the citizen as an agitator for what Morrison calls an intellectual home and a spiritual home for all. Sometimes the critic citizen's advocacy takes the form of soliciting and distributing material support. Sometimes it takes the form of editorial work, which Morrison performed assiduously throughout her career. But most of the time it takes the form of nourishing what she calls the public life of the community, which benefits from small daily demonstrations of reading, writing, and speaking, from the maintenance of spaces that remain free and open to all and that kindle a warm reciprocity of exchange. And she imagines her audience in these settings as student citizens of all ages who know they are welcome for more than the ticket purchased or the applause. So where can we locate the most robust, exciting, and self-secure communities of critic citizens and student citizens today? It can be difficult to know. Neither the university nor the institutions of the print public sphere preside as the epicenter of cultural influence anymore. The old mechanisms of gatekeeping and the old hierarchies that the gatekeepers once upheld have eroded and in some cases have crumbled. The centrality of the US and the UK, indeed the centrality of the English language to the production and circulation of a globalized culture, has started to dwindle, especially across emergent media forms. The major instruments of production, of cultural production and distribution, are digital technologies controlled by billionaire oligarchs who have designed new insidious ways to profit from our verbal and visual acts. But they've also made it possible for anyone with basic literacy skills and access to the internet to provide commentary about any cultural object across a vast range of platforms, forms, mediums, and languages. This commentary can be of very low quality or a very high quality, depending on who you ask. It can circulate faster and wider, and it can generate more responses and at a quicker rate than commentary could at any previous moment in human history. It seems like criticism, or at least the potential for it, lives everywhere. And because it lives everywhere, it lives nowhere, having scattered into billions of unrelated utterances in billions of unrelated corners of the world. From one angle, the rapid and largely unregulated proliferation of criticism has caused a great deal of anxiety within the traditional centers of cultural authority. From another, there is a latent democratic, popularizing spirit to these disorienting developments. I don't mean to say that we are witnessing a textual free-for-all or even the radical democratization of writing. It's worth bearing in mind that 40% of the world still doesn't have internet access and that the basic literacy skills that I invoked remain wildly unequally distributed. But for a not insignificant portion of people, there has been a veritable explosion in the ability to evaluate and to engage with cultural objects, and for others to engage with these evaluations without significant barriers to entry. The fear and the hope born by these developments prompts me to revise the questions with which I opened my remarks. What is the function of criticism in a future in which the means of producing and disseminating commentary have been partially democratized? The cultural capital of universities and media institutions has been devalued, and the styles and publics of critical commentary have multiplied centrifugally. What is the function of criticism when everyone is or could be a critic? Scanning our fragmented scene of writing and reading, which Ulrich Beck and Pierre Bourdieu describe as a scene of organized irresponsibility, we may wonder if it's possible or desirable to elaborate any shared practices or rationales for criticism. How could we do so without reinscribing the authority of specific individuals or of exclusionary institutions? How could we encourage the cultivation of fair-minded judges rather than corrupt, unjust, incompetent, murderous policemen? The opposite of individual authority is collective history. To follow the lead set by history is to free oneself of the expectation or the desire that a single person or a select group of people in the present can make criticism anew or pronounce on how to make it better than how it has been practiced before. Yet I want to stress that the history I've sketched for you today is really a repressed history of knowledge, a history of non-authority. Its concepts are derived from the writings of women who in their respective times were often dismissed as faddish, fame-seeking, unserious, and marginal, even if they now appear to us as the fixed luminaries of English letters. With the exception of Morrison, these women were largely excluded from academia and its reading and writing publics, and even Morrison, as we've seen, routinely expressed her vexed relationship to the university and grounded her advocacy outside of it. These women worked hard to create their own reading publics, whether by publishing under pseudonyms or distributing their work themselves, or starting their own presses to publish their writing, and the writing of those they judged to be culturally important. And because they knew that women were rarely credited as having legitimate authority, or rather that whatever authority women had frequently was attributed to morally and politically dubious sources, they designed more sophisticated and less self-serious approaches to their own considerable powers. If these women have played little role in recent histories of metacriticism, that's because they kept a distance from its institutions of production and dissemination. And if they were denied the rewards of institutional membership, then they were also buffered from its peculiar and not always healthy social and psychological dynamics. Perhaps this is what explains their admirable epistemic curiosity, their allergy to making claims based solely on personal experience, their broad social and historical vision, their ceaseless effort to reconcile ordinary and common readers with extraordinary and uncommon ones, their refusal to separate passion from intellect, advocacy from critique, their ferocious intellectual discipline, and their utter lack of complacency. Their inclination was not to bully or to boast, it was not to taxonomize or to type, it was to explain what criticism can do and what it ought to do, and to model how it could be done with integrity and pleasure. Paradoxically, it's their non-authority, forged on the outskirts of once powerful institutions, that gives their concepts the collective authority to fill the void of the present. Cavendish's wit would tell us that the function of criticism is to entwine feeling and thought so as to create passion anew and press it in the service of persuasion. Eliot's discrimination would tell us that the function of criticism is to craft a precise language and practice a form that puts parts and wholes in relation so as to produce knowledge about the systematic nature of literature. Woolf's judgment would tell us that the function of criticism is to shape general taste subtly but irrefutably so as to expand people's evaluations along the axis of history and geography. And Morrison's advocacy would tell us that the function of criticism is to preserve at all costs the writers, the works, and the communities that one deems culturally essential, so as to salvage the art that will not survive the logic of the market and the people who won't survive the politics of the state. Thank you.
Is yours working?
Yeah.
Thank you, Merve, and that's okay. So I'm just going to ask a couple questions to get us started, but people should start thinking if they have questions to follow up, and we'll move to that shortly. So one concept I found myself thinking a lot about during your talk was this idea of charismatic authority that you described originally in relation to Cavendish and the idea of wit. But you also you sort of placed it as one of the anchoring virtues of a critic, but you also had a kind of skepticism of it, or there was skepticism of it at different points in the talk of charismatic authority as being something that sort of defines what makes good criticism. And I wondered, I guess, if you could say a little more about that and also how you see it in your own practice as a critic. I mean, I sort of described in my introduction the different tracks you've had in your own career. As a critic and, writing in places like The New Yorker, when you write about books you love, you certainly, I would say, deploy a certain kind of charismatic authority that's certainly not separable from what makes it criticism that people want to read and that are inspired by. On the other hand, in your academic work, you've done a lot of writing more about the institutional and genre conditions of in which criticism can take place. And so I was sort of curious about how you see those two things fitting together in your own work in relation to your talk.
Well, I'm always loath to talk about my own work, and I'm certainly not going to talk about my own charisma. So let me answer it in a completely abstract way, which is to say I would not want to essentialize charisma as the persuasive authority of a person's personality. I think that charisma is almost always generated by a disobedience or the performance of a kind of disobedience of other, let's say, bureaucratic forms of authority. I think that with Cavendish, part of the charismatic authority of wit is coming from the rejection of rhetoric. And that rejection of rhetoric, at least in something like The Blazing World, is performed in this fantastical, spectacular way where in order to reject the authority of the academies, she essentially creates a fictional universe for herself to govern over as an empress. And I think that often, I think there's actually a parallel here to the kind of critics or the kinds of theorists who have claimed their charismatic authority by seeming to exist outside of the kinds of bureaucratic institutional structures that would constrain them, that would make them mere office holders. It seems like they can somehow transcend that, like the rules don't apply to them, like they have the capacity to say whatever they want or to take the kinds of risks or the courage that Parisia, for instance, demands. But that can't be explained as some fundamental feature of their embodied self. It's always happening against a backdrop or against a horizon of a certain kind of regimenting institutionality, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's because one of the things, I mean, you mentioned at the end that all four of these figures that you talked about were either outside of the university and the sort of institutionalized conversations of their time or had a somewhat vexed relationship with it. And so that's why I was sort of thinking about you yourself, though, have been in literary studies and have sort of, we've talked a lot over the years about the question of how literary studies deals with that charismatic aspect of literature. And that's sort of the background of why I think it's an interesting question for you.
Yeah, no. I mean, yes, it is an interesting question. I mean, I think... So yes, I still very much think of myself as a literary scholar, but I think part of what happens when you begin to write outside of certain professionally legitimated forms is that there is a curiosity and perhaps a skepticism about how committed you are as the subject of a discipline, or a disciplined subject, to the existence of those professionalized, the continued existence of those professionalized forms, right? I realize I'm speaking I realize I'm speaking quite abstractly, but I do think that has to be part of the source or the origin of where that kind of charismatic authority comes from. You feel like you are encountering someone whose formation or deformation can't be completely accounted for by a production process that you can otherwise anatomize or that you can track in a quite regular kind of way.
I was also curious, just in your capacity as a teacher and in this criticism program, you're teaching undergraduates who have been, are coming of age in this media world that you described toward the end of your talk with a certain kind of democratization of criticism. And I'm curious what you see as the biggest challenges for them, maybe thinking along the lines of these 4 features you've laid out, what you think is sort of hardest for them, and what's the biggest challenge for them to become the kind of critics that they want to become.
Oh, I mean, there are so many different challenges. Let me think about the best way to explain that. I taught a class. I might have talked about this when I was on the screen. Last year. I teach this practical criticism class that's for poetry, but as anyone who teaches poetry knows, the critical protocols that have developed to judge and interpret poetry are simply inappropriate to the judgment and interpretation of the novel as a form, right? That is, I really do not believe that a good way to perform criticism on a novel is to excerpt passages from it and then subject those to the kind of close reading that works much better when you have an entire poem in front of you. So I taught this class called Practical Criticism for the Novel, and I purchased Middlemarch. I purchased 25 copies of Middlemarch. I sent it to the print shop. I had them unbind the book and then rebind it into 8 serialized installments and then handed it out to them over the course of the semester. And it was funny to watch my students react to the next installment of Middlemarch as if it was the next episode of White Lotus. They were like, oh my God, this cliffhanger, what's going to happen with Dorothea and Will? And I was like, it's like on Gutenberg. You can just go. But they didn't, but they really wanted to commit to the exercise, And at the end of that class, we were talking a little bit about how beleaguered they feel by all of these pieces about our students don't read anymore, our students don't read anymore. And they were like, well, what if the publishing industry, what if our teachers actually thought about the media forms that we've grown up with and tried to think about how to take these older forms like the novel, these older technologies like the novel, and adapt them to the media life worlds that we inhabit, right? And I was like, that actually must be really hard, where the expectation is on, or it feels like people, it's like when you're in a relationship, and it's like when you're in a relationship and the other person is like, no, you do all the changing. And you're like, why do I have to do all the changing? You should also change a little bit, right? So I feel like it's hard for them to feel like everyone is expecting them to change, but no one within existing pedagogical structures is trying to think about how to change these older technologies to make them more kind of seamlessly integrated with the lives that they live, which I don't think is a bad thing. So I think that is quite difficult for them. Yeah.
Do you find that this sort of, and people can start thinking about questions after this, but do you find that this sort of democratization that you mentioned of them having access to Substack and social media all the time, and in a sense access to criticism and judgments being made about artworks all the time, whether they're novels or films or albums, do you find it makes them more confident in making judgments, or makes it harder for them to do that and be discerning, as in their own confrontations with art?
I think they feel like, because things are so, I think they feel that because things are so siloed, right, that there isn't one book that everyone is reading, or one show that everyone is watching, or one album everyone is listening to. I think they feel that because of the kind of personalization structure of their largely algorithmic world, what's hard for them isn't reconciling with the strength or the weakness of their judgment. It's feeling like they have nobody to talk to about it. So they might very well have that strength of judgment, that strength of feeling, but the question is, who do I share it with? And I think even imaginatively, it can be hard for them to figure out who they're speaking to, even if they're just speaking or trying to speak in their own heads to a kind of imaginary interlocutor.
Right.
I mean, and that we could get deeper into kind of theories of judgment or what that means for theories of judgment. But that's what I notice is a kind of, I don't want to make this banal and say it's a loneliness, but there is a kind of solitude in cultural experience that they're constantly trying to find their way out of, which is why I think the classroom or a version of the classroom has to continue to be an incredibly important place for doing just this.
Yeah. So, okay, do people have some questions? Rachel? It's interesting. On the one hand, they experience everything together all at once, but on the other hand, there's like this lonely, this sort of solipsism of the experience too.
Yeah. When you think of modern narrative forms, what do you think about the possibility for doing criticism within fictional works, like the way there was Shakespeare criticism in a work like Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship or Ulysses, or social criticism in a work like Middlemarch? How could that continue in the modern world?
I mean, I think it does continue. I think some of the most interesting novelists working today are working precisely at this boundary between fiction and criticism and are thematizing the difficulty of distinguishing between those or meaningfully distinguishing between those as discourses. I mean, J.M. Coetzee is the first person that comes to mind in response to that question. Perhaps more someone who's a little bit more our contemporary would be Ben Lerner. Sally Rooney, I think, is doing that kind of work. I mean, I do also just think that fiction almost always comes bearing its own critical apparatus. This is part of what I think Eliot is getting at when in her notes on discrimination, which is that the best novelists, to my mind, have a kind of architecture or a logic of totality that you see very much at play in their novels, and the interesting moments are when that slips somehow, right? But I don't think you even need that criticism to be explicitly demarcated as criticism per se. I think the self-critical impulse in the work of the novelist is very strong, beginning perhaps with very basic choices about narration, point of view, things like that. All these just sort of basic narratological terms let the novel contain its own self-critical apparatus. Thank you.
Hi. I was really...
What's your name?
I'm Ria.
Hi, Ria.
Hi. We're in the home of the Second City. Chicago is full of improv and comedy, and I was really taken aback by your conversation about wit, and I was especially thinking about the connection to the figure that refused to live critique for your podcast.
We had to do a lot of editing to make to save her from herself. I don't think Christine would mind me saying that. But
but I was wondering, to what degree do you think improvisation is necessary for natural eloquence, as you put it, or critique? Because I do improv on campus, and I think that it's something that's taught me so much about critique, and so I saw a lot of relations in your conversation.
That's wonderful, and you're making me revise my whole feeling toward improv comedy, which is mostly fear.
It's terrifying.
But what I will say is that there is natural eloquence, and then for me at least, there is a way that the spontaneity of speech is also dialectically links up to writing. So just a really concrete example of this is that, of course, when we produce the podcast, we record a live event much like this one, but then we have an audio editor who edits, and I edit the transcript. and I go back and forth between the audio and the transcript to figure out how to structure something that sounds spontaneous, but still sort of lets my guest appear in their best possible light. The consequence of this for me is that oftentimes when I speak in public, I'm seeing in my mind, or I'm thinking of what the transcript of what I am saying will read like. And this is a very old practice. I mean, it really draws on a set of mnemonic or cognitive techniques that would have been familiar to medieval monks. The medievalist Mary Carruthers has a fantastic book on the craft of thought. So I think that there's a way that oral practices of speech might contain some kernel of natural eloquence, but the more they end up engaging with writing, the more they end up being intextualized, as discourse analysts might say, the more the craft of writing and editing and the craft of thought end up being mutually reinforcing arts. I hope that answers your question. I realize it's not specific to improv comedy, but but I think there's room for improv to be part of that structure of forms.
If I could follow up, do you think that I guess I'm still not sure your personal opinion on the necessity of writing criticism.
Right.
And so
Yeah. I actually don't. It's not that I don't know what my personal opinion is. I think it's necessary to keep writing criticism. I think a really important cultural form would be lost if we stopped writing criticism. I'm certainly not saying that everybody needs to be podcasting all the time. That would be hell. Don't do that.
It's already happening.
Do not do that. Yes, I know. It's awful. No. But now they all need video because no one listens to the podcast, right? We've just become a completely visual culture at this point. But what I am saying is that I think, and this maybe gets back to your question about charismatic authority, John, and the horizon of certain kinds of professional expectations, I think that the overemphasis on writing as the primary or the privileged site for the production of criticism means that there are all kinds of publics that we are, as it were, leaving on the table. And I am always surprised that more people who write about criticism or who think about criticism don't have a robust or a coherent account of their own classroom practice or their own classroom experience, because to me, it's the classroom, it's the seminar room in particular, not the lecture room, the seminar room in particular, where the movement of thought takes on all those aspects of wit and discrimination and judgment and advocacy. That to me really is the prime place. And that's where I think so much of that craft of thought is happening that then ends up being transmuted into the craft of writing. Seems like improv. Oh God, have I been doing improv all this time and I don't know it?
It's possible.
Yeah.
My question is...
What's your name?
I'm Benny. Nice to meet you.
Hey, nice to meet you.
My question is sort of related to this question, which is that in your lecture, you seem to present wit as a kind of, in a way, fundamentally individual thing, right? That the way that what's-her-name is reacting against the sort of contemporary episteme is...
No, you have to remember the woman's name if you're going to ask the question.
Cavendish.
Thank you. That was so hard.
I apologize for my boorishness.
This is wit. This is charismatic authority produced against a horizon of institutionalized...
Well, then this will be relevant.
Sorry, I'm done ribbing you. Go.
That's fine. This will be relevant then. You know, I think of in the German tradition, wit is theorized very differently as a kind of essentially social phenomenon. I think of, it recalls to me a fragment from Schlegel, which is something like, wit is artful sociality. And, there's, of course, in that tradition, there's no wonder that in the 18th and 19th centuries, the fragment became the kind of preeminent aesthetic mode because it enforces a regime of wittiness both on the reader and on the writer. So my question is, or I guess my request is, can you speak a little bit more about the social component of wit, particularly as somebody who has written, in a way, collaborative, dialogical criticism? Can you speak about how wit emerges as a kind of dialectical phenomenon? I mean, this is related to this notion of spontaneity, that wit doesn't just come to be you alone in your room, but wit comes to be organically as a function of conversation.
Okay, I was going to say maybe we can talk about reading room finally.
John's failed experiment, or our failed experiment.
Our
failed. Okay, so I just want to ask you to clarify one thing so I can make sure I'm answering the question or engaging with the question appropriately, which is, to me, the account of wit as produced against a horizon of bureaucratic professionalized expectations or habituses is a social explanation for the production of wit. That's not an individual sitting in their room, right? But you, I sense, seem unpersuaded by that, or you want a social account that is some way different from that account. So tell me what it is you want so I can give you what you want. Or we can talk about reading room, or do you just want me to talk about collectivity?
Well, what I'm interested in is, and this is sort of related to this previous question about, there's a way in which the written criticism strikes me as kind of fundamentally at its core individual phenomenon. Like there's a kind of tyranny of the singular authorial voice. Yes, you can work to engender a kind of heterodoxia, but it fundamentally
I see. Okay, so actually, I am going to talk about reading room. This is
Thank
actually
you.
this is a nice segue. Do you want to explain what reading room is to those who don't?
Reading room was a collaborative. There were four literary critics, four people in English departments who started. We decided to try to have a collective column where each column would respond to the one before it, and they would be about essentially everyday experiences of reading that these scholars were having, but that sort of they were having as individuals in their lives. Sorry, and they would try to respond to each other. It taught me it's very hard to work with four people in English department at once. But anyway, you can talk about what happened.
Well, I actually think that what you're talking about is more something like these slippages of style, or the moment where one person is speaking in a particular way, a particular idiom, let's say, a particular sociolect, and then all of a sudden kind of code switches. And that code switch produces a moment of surprise, of shock, of humor, to get back to the question about improv, because something has happened that was unexpected, and perhaps there is, along with that shock, that surprise, depending on what theory of humor you subscribe to, the desire for a corrective to the individual's exercise of their wit. And the example that I can think of in Reading Room was John's friend Tim Aubrey wrote a piece about, what was it exactly about? It was about like longing for women while reading or something like that, right? I'm really butchering this.
Yeah, I mean,
yes, okay.
Something like that.
Okay, yeah. It was like about, reading in coffee shops to pick up women. I don't know. This is really unfair to Tim, who's a very nice guy. And I wrote a piece in response about the figure, the type of the longing man.
This was not what Tim had called himself.
Right. And then
important to the wit.
Right. And it was a moment where presumably we were engaged in this collective project together, but Tim had produced something that I found sort of sentimental and maudlin and self-indulgent in all sorts of terribly masculinist ways. And I was like, well, I'm going to write about how ridiculous I feel like people like you are, and ultimately how completely unextraordinary, right? Because you are a type, and you mentioned Schlegel. I would say you are a type that Goethe first really gave us in Goethe, right? You are a type. You think your feelings are extraordinarily special, but in fact, your feelings are only the product of structural forces that reify individual feeling as special and precious and whatever. Anyway, so that was a moment where I felt like the exercise of wit against this kind of social collective experiment was risky and possibly led to the breakdown of the reading
Destroyed
group.
reading room.
Destroyed the reading group. The reading room. I burned down the reading room with the longing man. So that is a perhaps different answer to your question about the social capacity or the what's on the other side of the what's on the other side of the individual in that dialectic of wit, and what the dangers are perhaps of leaning too heavily on one side of that dialectic.
Yeah, and that was an experiment, I think, in trying to do something kind of improvisational with reading, in a sense where we were trying to have people respond to one another in the way they do in everyday life when you get together to talk about your reading experiences. And, that was, I would say, it was half successful and half a disaster, but it was interesting. I mean, that was sort of what we were going for.
Yeah, writing destroys everything, though.
Yeah.
Writing and publishing.
We got a lot of questions.
Uh-oh. If they're about the longing man, see me after. You can buy me a drink and we can talk about that more.
Hi.
Hi, what's your name?
I'm Audrey.
Hi, Audrey. Have we met before? You're so familiar.
No.
Okay, all right.
Definitely
Sorry.
not.
Okay.
First of all, it feels a little weird to be referred to as a they in the talk about, I guess, Gen Z and young people. So I was going to say that in terms of people of my generation, it feels quite intimidating for me personally to talk to others about my interests and tastes when it feels like there's a certain amount of authority that everyone carries around their own tastes. I think about a sticker that I have that says no music snobs, because it feels like everybody is kind of a music snob. So I was going to ask, it feels like people are creating their own little personal universe of taste, and the algorithm really kind of helps this along. So how do we kind of create environments that override this personal authority and this individual domain of tastes? And it sounds like maybe the reading room gets to this a bit.
No, because I destroyed it. What are you scared of? What frightens you, or what feels intimidating about expressing a judgment to you?
Because it always feels like someone might counter with something that I have not read or an album I have not heard.
But why is that frightening as opposed to an opportunity to read something else, to listen to something else?
Well, it feels like in a spontaneous discussion, I don't have the opportunity to go and do that and then form my own judgments about it before coming back to the discussion. Right. So I'm asked to form a judgment about something that I maybe have never read.
But I suppose this does get back to the reading room, because presumably part of the offering of the kinds of communities of judgment, of art making, and of art receiving or consumption is that they don't cohere for just a single moment and then never again. I think I guess what's interesting to me about what you're saying is that it doesn't feel like you can then go read that thing that you haven't read, or listen to that album you haven't heard, and then come back to the people you were having that conversation with and say, look, I read this thing, I listened to this thing, here is how the horizon of possible works against which I'm judging this work have changed, and here is how my judgment has changed. So to me, this sounds less like a problem of being intimidated by certain forms of cultural authority and more like a problem of longevity and repetition. How do we return to spaces where we can make our judgments anew and make them from a place of more reading, more listening, more feeling, more thinking? And it makes me sad to hear that you feel like that doesn't exist. And I think that's how, I don't want to say they or call Gen Z young people, but I do think that this is what I hear from my students all the time. And I think that part of our responsibility as critic citizens, as educators, as just people who want to see certain kinds of art forms and certain ways of talking about art continue in this world, is to make sure we can give you that possibility of longevity. We have to create those spaces over and over and over again and invite people back to them over and over and over again. So, and if other people aren't doing that for you, then you have to do it for yourself. And that's hard, but when I think about my students, I think the most incredible ones are the ones who felt like that wasn't available to them and then started their own slam poetry night or started their own magazine, or, you know, kind of had the if you build it, they will come mentality about the enterprise of cultural production. So I hope I can come back in a year and we can have this conversation again, and I will hear something different, is my hope.
Thanks.
Do we have time for one more question?
Sorry, guys, I'll stay out. You can come ask me questions afterwards.
I don't know.
I didn't hear.
You have to decide, Rachel.
Oh, God.
Let me see. We can just oh my God.
We could take a few questions maybe, and if people can keep them short, we could do a few questions and then you
lightning
can respond.
round.
Well, I gotta say, I hate the lightning. I'm sorry.
Oh, you hate it. Okay,
I hate
sorry.
the lightning round. I just can't keep them all in my head, and then I feel bad that I haven't answered
All right,
like
Merve,
half of them.
dealer's choice.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh my God. You. Sorry. Don't fall.
On what you were saying about charismatic authority and wit, I'm kind of thinking back to your first piece that I read about Susan Sontag on women, and what I took from that was that the critic is required to have a sense of generosity and kindness, and I was wondering, with wit being kind of with Cavendish saying that there's the empress of wit, and with wit sometimes being a dominating form, how do you grapple that? Do you think there's a tension there between the generosity of the critic and the wit of the critic, or is there something that needs to be grappled with?
No, because at least the definition of wit that I'm drawing on is a very particular kind of mid-17th century understanding of it. So it's not about scoring points, and she's very clear about that in the World's Olio. It's funny because that introduction, or that piece on, or the introduction to Sontag's essays on women, for me, the thrust of that introduction is less about wit and more about her continued attempt to deploy camp as a meaningful political aesthetic strategy. And there's something interesting to be said, and I don't know what it is just now, about where wit and camp might come into contact with one another. But generosity, I don't think is the operative term there. It is in some of the other pieces I've written. But there, you're making me wonder if perhaps the updated version of wit for the 20th century is camp, and if we could actually trace that concept from Cavendish to someone like Sontag who had many of the same anxieties as the people that I've evoked in this piece and went about establishing her authority in many of the same ways. Thank you. That was great.
you.
All right. Thank you, Merve.
You're very welcome, John. Thank you.
So glad you finally made it to University of Chicago.
Yeah.